trainings in person, and conferences around the country, in academic departments, even with police departments locally and throughout the state of Michigan. And so I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk about street harassment and provide a context to a national audience through webinars. It's very exciting. So I am a clinical community psychologist and a professor at Michigan State University. And the work that I have been doing often focuses on these kinds of events and how they can be traumatic. So one of the things you'll see me focus on is how do we reduce the trauma that comes along with these types of experiences, whether you are experiencing them directly or you are a witness. And that is a very distinctly different lens than what usually happens when people are talking about harassment, because usually those are more organizational psychologists or people from business, and they're focused on the bottom line for the organization, not the human beings behind it. So that is one of the things that's directly important to me, making sure that we're talking about trauma reduction. So during this webinar, I'm going to do things to try to make it interactive. And part of what I will be doing is having questions that I invite you to answer. I will present the questions generally with a 2-minute window where you can begin to share your thoughts. So if you are able to get pen and paper to write your thoughts privately if you want, that's great. In addition, if there are things that you're willing to share with the group, I invite you to do so through the Zoom webinar chat. This will allow everyone to see your answers and to have a little bit more of a community feel as we have this discussion. And then finally, at the end, there will be a set of resources, other videos you can watch, other websites that have follow-up material to what I'll be talking about today. I invite you to look at those. And the video is going to be made available, and you'll receive a link telling you where to find it later. So interrupting street harassment, what to do, how to do it. I'm going to talk about some of the research behind it. I'm going to give you some definitions and terms, but I'm going to really try to focus on what are people doing successfully and what are the barriers to doing those things and how can you overcome those barriers. When we're talking about street harassment, the definition I'm going to go with comes from stopstreetharassment.org. And this says street harassment is gender-based. Street harassment is unwanted comments, gestures, and actions forced on a stranger in a public place without their consent and is directed at them because of their actual or their perceived sex, gender, gender expression, or sexual orientation. Now, if you've already seen the video, 10 Hours of Walking in New York as a Woman, this features Shoshana Roberts. You're probably very familiar with what these kinds of things look like. Better yet, if you are a woman who's had to walk down public streets, you've probably had some of these kinds of experiences already. And this includes things like catcalls, being flashed, whistling, having people leer at you, make sexualized gestures, homophobic or transphobic slurs, requests for someone's phone number or their name or to stop and talk. We also see that it can go as far as being witness to public masturbation, being sexually assaulted, and unfortunately, even cases of rape. And when you look at these videos, there's also an interesting phenomenon that I noticed that I haven't really heard people talking about. And there's this element of individuals walking down the street with the woman. So she's ignoring them, she's trying to keep going, and the individual just starts walking with her close enough to physically touch her, close enough that it almost would look as if they're a couple walking down the street, and might do so for blocks. So it's very intimidating, very frightening, and keeps the individual on edge. And of course, where these things happen, they happen in any public space. We often will hear about it when people are walking down the street or when they're taking mass transit. But you see that this happens outside of workplaces. It happens around schools. Any public space is a space where people can be targeted. So I want to take a couple minutes at this, just at the start, to get you thinking about what are some of the experiences. So I'll give you a couple minutes. I want you to answer, and again, if you feel comfortable, answer through the chat function on Zoom so that we can all see your answers. But what type of harassment do you see happening in your community? What kind of harassment do you see focus as an element of focus in the news? And what consequences do you see for individuals who either experience street harassment or the perpetrators, maybe bystanders, or even people in the community? What are you seeing? And I'll give, how about 3 minutes, and you can take any of those questions and answer in chat. I'll jot down some of my answers too. People yelling on the street and out of cars. So looking at these examples, these are incredibly powerful examples people are talking about. Things like people having anti-immigrant, anti-Black incidences, women wearing a hijab being told that they should go home or having things thrown at them. There have been lots of incidences where, in particular, women have had their hijab pulled off of them or pulled back so that it actually causes them to fall or choke. And also, people are accurately talking about the absence of this information on the news. And when we get to our next couple of slides and we're talking about how commonplace this is and how prevalent street harassment is, it makes the absence in our local and national news community really striking, very disturbing. Wow, so I'm hoping everybody can see all of the chat comments, but one of the participants noting that a student wearing a hijab was asked, do you kill people? Have you killed people? Oh yes, and being asked to smile, being solicited for sex. And again, when we talk about what are the consequences for perpetrating street harassment largely seem to be invisible. Now, there are some communities where they have instituted consequences for street harassment. This can be a good thing to check in with your local or your school police departments to see what are the options when these things happen. But you may also be in one of the many communities where there's really nothing official on the books. There's no significant consequence if it's mentioned at all. And it leaves people struggling for, where do I turn when these things happen? Or where do I turn when I want to support people that this is done to? So yes, excellent examples. So when we talk about gender-based street harassment, what we know is that women and men are both targeted, but women tend to be the most frequent targets, as are individuals who might identify as LGBTQ or someone who other people may perceive that way. And when you look at who's perpetrating these acts, that's not random either. It tends to be men that are engaging in these behaviors, and they're doing it towards individuals who are either a gender or a sexual minority. And when they've looked at these behaviors, there's been several studies across various cultures around the world, and what they're finding is this kind of behavior is ubiquitous around the world. It happens in every country. It happens despite what the cultural mores are around sexuality and around public behavior. Every race and culture has been engaging in this and engage in it frequently. So when you look at the statistics here, you see that on the norm, well over 60% of women in each of these countries report having had these experiences. And some of them have identified when did these experiences start, and they find that girls as young as 10, 11, 12 are having experiences where walking down the streets, people are saying things that are sexually inappropriate, provocative, and trying to elicit some kind of sexual response from teenage girls, from little girls. And so these are the numbers from a variety of different countries. But of course, we've also had lots of these studies done within the US, and these have had a range of results, but one of the more conservative estimates indicate that over 65% of women and over 25% of men have indeed experienced gender-based street harassment. And when they ask about who's perpetrating this harassment, it's almost exclusively men. To help individuals think about how common this is and where it's occurring, there are several services. I think I Holla Back is one of the first that has started doing this, where they are mapping these experiences onto city maps such as Google. And you can also, if you're interested in doing something like this, you can start doing this within your own community. But they have ways that you would respond and tell people where harassment has happened. And then a map will be generated that documents those events. And I'm going to show you 3 major cities where these events have happened. Chicago, I choose Chicago because it's my hometown. And each of these little bubbles is an incident of harassment that was reported to the ihollerback.org, either through their app or through the website. Now, when you think about what you might be able to do with this information, one, it's concrete indication that these events are happening. Despite the commonplace nature of them, despite how widespread it is, a lot of people just don't believe this stuff really happens. So getting this kind of information documented can be really powerful in at least proving that it's happening. But on top of that, people have begun using these kinds of maps to help plan their routes as they go to work or to school, or they're going to a different event. So they can look and see which are the streets where harassment seems to be happening quite a bit. Maybe I should avoid those streets. And people are using these documents to work with the organizations and the businesses that are in these areas and help determine what kind of intervention strategies might be used and how they can get the local businesses involved in helping to reduce street harassment. So like I said, this is Chicago. This is a map of Los Angeles. And this is a map of New York City. Now, what we have to also remember is these are vast underestimates of what's happening. These are individuals who chose to log into an app or log into these sites and put their experience down. So perhaps each one of these could represent thousands of separate events that are not being recognized by any particular news media outlet or app of this nature. But it's certainly a wonderful start. So when we're talking about harassment, we also have to remember that women are not equally at risk, and their experiences are not going to be the same. And I like to talk about this and also frame it within intersectionality theory. Intersectionality theory emphasizes how combinations of social group memberships and our social group identifications create unique social locations and positions for individuals. And because of those unique locations and positions, it influences their perceptions of the world, the experiences they have, and the kind of outcomes they have following these experiences. And what's important is intersectionality theory stresses the importance of considering the combination of group memberships and identities if you want to more thoroughly understand the unique experiences people have in their worldviews. And often discussed with intersectionality theory is this idea of double or multiple jeopardy. This says that when individuals belong to multiple marginalized groups, they increase, or their risk of being victimized is increased. So if I am a gender minority, I'm more likely to experience gender-based mistreatment. As an ethnic minority, I'm more likely to experience race-based mistreatment. But there may also be unique forms of mistreatment that are targeting me because of my intersection of race and gender marginalized statuses. So what we see is that women of color often experience intersectional forms of harassment, and they experience higher rates of harassment and more physically or sexually severe types of harassment. And this study by StopStreetHarassment.org shows some of that, where you see that both verbal harassment and physically aggressive types of harassment are more frequently reported by Black and Latina women compared to white women. The definition I gave you earlier about street harassment specifically noted gender-based mistreatment. And this is important because it allows us room to think about street harassment beyond just considerations of gender. Now, the movement started because of an effort to look at gender-based street harassment. But we're now starting to expand this and think about this in a larger community and in more ways. So in the last slide, I showed you that women of color are differentially targeted for gender-based harassment. But what we know is that people of color are also at risk for being targeted for street harassment that targets them due to race or other marginalized identity, such as being transgender, being a religious minority, and in particular, in our current climate, the Muslim community. This particular map that I'm showing you here was published by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a civil rights organization that's based out of Alabama, and they've been tracking hate groups for well over 45 years. And they released a full report, and this is in the references and resources at the end of the presentation. And in the report, they looked at the spike in hate crimes that occurred just after our recent election. And in looking at just the 10 days following the election, they saw over 867 hate-based incidences across the country. Now, to be really clear, these would be cases that either were reported in national media outlets or individuals logging in to report hate or hashtag report hate and documenting their experiences, which again speaks to how much of an underestimate these numbers are. But in that 10 days, they saw nearly 900 hate-based incidences. Now, I am happy to say that despite that dramatic increase, they did see that over that 10 days, they did begin to taper down. And by the end of the 10 days, they had had far fewer reports. However, they're still happening, and this we do know. So some examples from the Southern Poverty Law Center's reports include a mother from Colorado who wrote, "My 12-year-old daughter is African American. A boy approached her and said, 'Now that Trump is president, I'm going to shoot you and all the blacks I can find.'" And another reported, "I was standing at a red light waiting to cross the street. A black truck with 3 white men pulled to the red light. One of them yelled, 'Fuck your black life.' And the other 2 began to laugh. One began to chant, 'Trump, Trump, Trump,' as they drove away." And in Silver Spring, Maryland, a woman berated a Latino worker for not working fast enough. She demanded to know where he was from. And despite the fact that he was born here in the US, she repeatedly yelled, "This is my country," and kept referring to him as El Salvador. And as we've already discussed, Muslim women wearing hijabs have been particularly vulnerable to threats and assault. There have been stories of women being grabbed by their hijab, including a San Jose State University student who was choked and fell when a man pulled on her headscarf from behind while she was in a parking garage. As part of their research, SPLC also tried to determine, where are these things happening? Are they happening in particular spaces? Are there ways in which we can encourage people to be safe? And what they found is that the most common spaces where these events were happening were just random events on the street, but also things happening within stores or shopping centers such as malls, and sadly in K-12 school settings. So when we talk about consequences of street harassment, here I'm talking specifically about what are the consequences for those individuals who are targeted and the communities within which they live. So these are not consequences in the sense of punishments for perpetrators. But when we look at individuals who have been subjected to street harassment, there are certain things that are very common, and these are also things that are common when you experience trauma more generally. So individuals report higher levels of anxiety, increased post-traumatic stress symptoms. There's also a latent effect for depression, meaning you don't immediately see the onset of depression, but over time there is a trend that's reliably related back to street harassment for rates of depression increasing. You also see that individuals become very hypervigilant. They're terrified, they're always on guard, and they have increased amounts of fear. But there are also longer-term economic consequences for individuals, because people that experience street harassment are far more likely to perhaps drop out of school as a way of avoiding having to make that walk and be subjected to these comments and behaviors. And individuals may leave a job if they're going to have to, in their attempt to get to work, if they regularly experience harassment. And when you look at their health outcomes, you see that individuals who are regularly experiencing street harassment also report a host of physical health problems. And these are the same kinds of problems that we see for anyone who has a chronic stressor. So things like immune suppression and autoimmune disease, regular chronic health problems. And sadly, what we know is that the increased risk of stress over time can also be associated with things like increased rates of cancer and other things like the autoimmune diseases like lupus. But we would be remiss if we only talked about this as a consequence for that individual who's targeted, because we know that people who are bystanders or witnesses to these events have similar reactions and responses. So you will also see that bystanders will start to have increased anxiety and hypervigilance, fear that they will be targeted next. They can also have, if this is a chronic experience, similar health problems as those that are targeted. And of course, there are community consequences for having these kinds of events going on in your community. One, you see that the community is less cohesive. There is often lower investment in the community by its members. There is less use of public community spaces, reduced use of mass transit. There's reduced walking. So what are people doing? If they're able, they're taking cars and other ways of getting to locations, things that don't put them at as high risk of being harassed. And it also is sending a general message that in your community, these kinds of bigoted events are okay, which can then influence when people want to, say, move to that community. So this is another opportunity for you to share your thoughts in the chat, answering some of these questions. One, I invite you to write briefly about a time where you either directly experienced or directly witnessed street harassment. And talk about things like, where did you notice, what did you notice in your body? What kinds of thoughts or fears did you have? How did you respond when it happened? And if you would, what do you wish you had done? What would you like to do the next time you see something like this? So I will also give a few minutes for everyone to share their thoughts on that. I'll put the timer on, and then we can talk about the responses as a group. Okay, so that was about 3 minutes, and I'm looking at the chat responses. These are excellent examples. And what I'm seeing in the responses, one is that even as a bystander, in fact, one of you noted that simply hearing the stories has made at least one of you feel very sick. And that is part of what is so damaging about these kinds of events, and that even hearing them second and third hand, it can be very personally upsetting. Oh, you can't see the responses. Taylor, could you see if you can make the responses public?
Sure.
We'll see. Thank you.
I'm sorry that we thought that we were under the wrong impression that we thought that they were public. So let me see what I can do.
Okay, thank you. Yes, because these examples and responses are really incredibly powerful. And what I'm seeing is not only how distressing these experiences are, but the struggle people are having and what to do, where sometimes it feels like, well, maybe I need to let this go. Other times it feels like, well, if they say something directly to me, then I should say something. I imagine there's still the question of what exactly do I say? How do I say it? How can I be most effective in what I say? And then at least one participant talked about showing solidarity with the person that is targeted. And these are all really important strategies. So let's talk a little bit about why is this so incredibly hard? What is it that's going on that makes it so that in those moments when it really counts, we sometimes have no idea what we need to say? So there's lots of things happening that are contributing to this. One of the things that makes it difficult is that these are really quick events. I mean, often the experience itself is less than 30 seconds. And really to respond in an effective manner, we have to be able to come up with something pretty good with only a few more seconds. And during that same time that we are supposed to be responding effectively, we're also processing a series of questions that are interfering with us figuring out what to do. So often people say, one of the things they find themselves thinking is, well, did what I think just happen? Is that really what happened? And so they are replaying it in their mind, trying to say, like, yeah, that is what the person just said. Was this deliberate, or was it an unintentional slight? They're thinking about, well, what should I do now? How do I respond? If I bring it up and they deny it, then what? How am I going to prove this? Is it, and I saw one of the people almost wrote this, like, is this really worth the effort? Or is it just better if I drop it and move on? And what are going to be the consequences if I bother to say anything? The perpetrator is just going to deny it, or maybe they'll invalidate me, or maybe they'll even retaliate, and I'm afraid. So perhaps that 30 seconds that I have to respond effectively has passed simply in the time it's taken me to process some of these common questions. But it's not just what's happening inside of our thinking processes or in our head that is interfering. There's also a process that our bodies are undergoing when we experience an acute trauma of that nature. And everything about our body's response counters our responding effectively. And this is called diffuse physiological arousal, or people will sometimes refer to it as DPA. In the counseling literature, if you are somebody who's familiar with counseling, with couples counseling, they will often talk about this as flooding. But basically, the DPA process is what's involved when you have to engage in fight, flight, or freeze. And this harkens back to our ancient ancestors a millennia ago, who, when faced suddenly with a tiger about to pounce on them, they had to make real decisions on how they were going to fight for their lives, or run for their lives, or freeze and play dead and hope that the lion doesn't see them or want to eat them at that point. And when we have to make those kinds of decisions, our body will automatically engage in this process of diffuse physiological arousal. Now, luckily, most of us are not in a position where we might actually be eaten by a lion. But our body doesn't know the difference. when we end up in a situation where we are afraid or we are in conflict with someone else and our heart rate starts to increase and our response begins to get amplified, our body goes into this process just like it did a millennia ago. And if you're an athlete, one marker that your body has gone into this flooding zone is if your heart rate has hit over 80. But for the rest of us, the non-athletes in the room, really the marker of the distress is when our heart rate is over 100. And what happens when we go into flooding? Well, one, it heightens our perceptions of threat. So we begin to hone in on where is the danger, what is the threat, and we block out lots of other information. All of the periphery, all of the ancillary information gets blocked out. What's also critically important is that our frontal lobe here, the front part of our brain, this is where we are able to do our creative thinking. This is where we can come up with witty refrains. That just goes offline. It shuts down. Our body begins to focus in on only those resources that are absolutely necessary for survival. So our brain kind of goes back into very rudimentary parts and ways of thinking. We also tend to focus or become honed in on our own responses that are much more focused on being hostile or aggressive or self-protective. Of course, again, we're terrified. Our body thinks we're fighting for our life. And so we are going for those responses that typify either being hostile or protecting ourselves. And another important piece of DPA is that it interferes with our ability to remember events in proper sequence. So in this state, we have better memory for the emotions that we felt than for the exact order in which things happened. And this can be really important if you're somebody who's working with someone who's had these kinds of experiences, or if you are somebody who's charged with evaluating the veracity of a case. Because when people are at that height of being traumatized, when they're at the height of DPA, the way the brain is organized and functions, they're not going to be able to give you proper sequencing. They're going to be able to tell you accurately the events that happen, but they may get the order mixed up. And when you're talking about interactions that are going back and forth, you probably have heard this in your own disagreements with people, where one person is saying, well, no, you said A, B, C, and that made me say X, Y, and Z. And you're saying, no, 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 I didn't say that until after you had already done these other things. And both of you believe you're right. And it's because your brains have encoded the emotion context, not the sequential context. And this, again, is really critically important when you're talking about law enforcement or people evaluating the credibility of someone who's coming forward with these kinds of events. And the other thing that often is happening when we're talking about things like street harassment is that the person that's doing the harassment, they're not in DPA. They're not in this moment where they're terrified, where they feel like they have to go into fight, flight, or freeze. So they are not in DPA, but the target is thrust into DPA. And this can be really important, again, when you're talking about when law enforcement or other people get involved, because one person can come off as calm, cool, and collected, the perpetrator, and that perpetrator is also able to keep thinking and planning and coming up with their good story, while the target has lost their frontal lobe in that moment. So they're not able to creatively think up stories or come up with refrains to the accusations. And often people use that as a mark that that person's story is not true or they are not credible. And that is absolutely not the case and should not be interpreted that way. Okay, so street harassment happens. What is it we can actually do about it? One, remember that when we engage in consistent, assertive responses to things like street harassment, you as an individual are likely to experience less and less of it over time. But also, when we collectively respond and assert that this is unacceptable in our communities, we begin to create the social changes that change social norms and change expectations about what kind of behaviors happen and are allowable. And those are the things that allow these kinds of behaviors to persist. So knowing what we can do about it is really critically important to creating this kind of widespread change. When I talk about this, I like to talk about this idea of what are we doing in the moment and face to face. And the first thing that you have to know is the fact that you have the right not to respond. Now, I personally hope you will choose to respond in one way or the other. And I'm hopefully going to provide you with several different tools that you can use to figure out the best response for any particular situation. But what you always should remember, and what should be more important than anything else, is that your well-being and your safety come first. I want all of us to live to fight another day. So keep that in mind. If it's not safe, whether that is physically safe, or again, I'm a clinical community psychologist, if it's not emotionally safe for you to act, you have the right not to respond. But I do think there is benefit to learning how to respond. And one, there's benefit to learning how to respond for those in the moment face-to-face interactions. And this is really tricky because one, these types of situations often only give us 30, maybe 45 seconds to respond. If we respond after that point, it's going to be awkward, it's not going to feel genuine, the person is not going to take it seriously. So we have to get good at responding really, really quickly. And the problem with that, as I just said, is we need to be able to do that when we are being flooded, which is really, really difficult to do. But why should you bother with something that is this incredibly difficult? Why should you bother practicing and getting good at responding in this way? Well, one, the more often you practice, the more comfortable you will get with responding. And this is going to reduce the long-term negative consequences of dealing with harassment. Meaning, part of what we struggle with when we have these kinds of events is the constant thinking about what we could have done, what we should have done, why didn't we do, being upset with ourselves for not responding. And that sense of powerlessness and hopelessness and helplessness actually contributes to our negative outcomes. So things like mental health consequences, physical health consequences. But individuals who are able to pull together their resources and respond in the moment stave off those long-term negative consequences. So they don't have the same detriment to their physical and mental health because they did not feel helpless in the moment. They did not feel as powerless as someone who was unable to respond. So there's a direct personal benefit to your well-being by learning how to respond in the moment in those face-to-face interactions. Although I admit they are the most frightening interactions. There's also a benefit to telling your story. So this is more about the why should you bother practicing it? Because in practicing your responses and going over these events, talking about it provides a benefit. Because you're processing what's happened, you're processing the information, you're also doing that socially, which invites an opportunity for validation. This reduces shame and leads to greater healing. And perhaps the saddest reason, the most pessimistic reason for why I think it's important that people prepare for future negative events like this, future harassment, is because future harassment, as in the society we currently live in, is inevitable. So you're going to likely either directly experience or to witness future harassment And if you've prepared for it, if you've practiced what you'll do, you'll have an increased chance of having a response that makes you proud of your response, that you feel empowered, that you responded in a way that you did not feel powerless and you did not feel helpless. So preparing for the fact that harassment is likely to come, as pessimistic as it is really quite critical for your well-being. Now, ironically, if you want to be good in the moment, face-to-face confrontations, then you're going to need to go to your past and then begin to practice for this hypothetical future. And there's several things that I invite you to do as part of that. One, we get better at controlling our physiological reactivity in the moment. And one of the things that happens when we have these very, very high stressor events, when we are going into flooding, our heart rate is hitting that 100, or if you're the athlete, that 80 beats per minute mark, is our breathing changes. And our breathing changes in ways that are detrimental, even furthering the detriment from flooding. Meaning, when we are frightened, we hold our breath. When we are distressed, we start to hold our breath. Or some people start to do a lot of really fast, shallow breathing, which is potentially going to lead them to hyperventilating. When we hold our breath because we're upset, we're actually furthering our brain's panic response, because our brain now is experiencing oxygen deprivation. And you can have the negative consequence, you can have cell death from as little as 30 seconds of oxygen deprivation. So our brain is going to hit panic mode very, very quickly if we're not breathing. Now, if you're already flooding and your brain is now panicked because it's not getting oxygen, it's going to send even more messages through your body that you're in danger, you need to panic, you need to do something. And it's going to further erode your ability to respond in a positive manner. So, deep breathing is very effective in trying to calm your system and get your frontal lobe back online so that you can effectively respond to these situations. So one, the deep breath can give you a moment to think and pause. But what I encourage people to do is practice deep breathing on a regular basis. This is just good for you, period. But practice deep breathing on a regular basis so that when you are upset, your body can start to do that automatically. That you have gotten to the point where you have just begun to pair that panic response with deep breathing. It's also helpful to begin to pay attention to what are the initial signs and those body cues you have that you might be starting to flood. And if you begin to recognize those things, then you can try to deliberately practice for how you're going to intervene when you notice those very first cues instead of waiting until you're fully flooded. Because if you intervene earlier, you can actually stop the flooding process from happening. And then you will be better prepared to address what's ever happening in the moment. So one of the first things is learning how to control your physiological reactivity. And one of the easiest and best ways to do this is by getting in touch with doing lots of deep breathing so that you can be very effective with pulling on that skill when you're distressed. And another thing that's quite important for being better prepared for future events is something that Howard Stevenson calls doing a recast of past events. And doing a recast of past events means that you talk about and you write about past experiences. And when you talk about or write about those past experiences, you want to specifically try to get in touch with where your body felt the distress, because that is going to be part of what you use as beginning to understand your initial cues of flooding. So in that event, When did you start to have physical sensations of distress? Where was that located? What did you notice? The other thing is that will help to get you closer to that experience and to the reaction you had at the time, which will also help you practice controlling the flooding response. When you are recasting the event, you also want to use this as a chance for a redo. So maybe when the event happened, you froze, you didn't know what to say, so you ended up not saying anything at all, or not saying something that you thought was particularly effective. Well, you get a redo when you recast. So you can create a variety of alternative responses for the situation. And in doing so, come up with the healthy comeback line that you like the most, that makes you feel the most proud of yourself, and that you can easily do even if you're beginning to flood. And then perhaps the most critical part of trying to prepare for the next harassment event that's surely going to come is you now take those alternative responses and practice what you'll do. And when I say practice, I mean real life practice. You are saying the words out loud. You're saying them in the way you want to say them in the moment. Maybe you even get some friends together and you rehearse and you role play and you try on different ways of responding. When I encourage people to do this, I encourage them to have at least 3 parties there. So you have one that's playing the perpetrator, one that's playing the person that's responding, and you have a third party that is watching to give feedback to the person responding. Because often when we are learning how to be assertive in these kinds of situations, we have some body language that isn't consistent with what we're trying to do. So maybe we're saying, stop talking to me, stop saying those things to me, but we're not making eye contact. We're looking at the ground. We're showing a less assertive, less powerful stance. And we don't know that we're doing it. So having a third party that can say, you said the right words, but when you said it, you did not seem to really believe it. You weren't being forceful. You weren't taking up enough space. Then you keep repracticing until you feel like you can own it, until you feel like you know how to respond. And part of why this is so important is because it's also building muscle memory. Because if you are flooded, but you have practiced this enough times, you'll be able to do it anyway. Your brain is not going to be able to come up with something new. Your brain is not going to be able to do something it hasn't done hundreds of times, well, not hundreds, let's say a few dozen times. But if you have already thought through a response and you've practiced it several times, that even though you're flooded, you're more likely to get it out and to get it out in an assertive, powerful way. So when you're considering how to respond to street harassment, some things that you want to think about or some things you want to do. One, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, assess your safety. When you're talking about people in the workplace harassing you, coworkers harassing you, at least you have some idea of their personality and the range of responses they're likely to give. When we're talking about street harassment, or harassment that happens in a public space, harassment from strangers in a public space, well, at this point, all bets are off. We don't know. We don't have a way of estimating how the person is going to respond. So you want to assess your safety. Have a sense of what is it the person seems to be doing. Are they being rallied up by a crowd? Is there somewhere where you can get to after you've said your piece? Are there people that seem sympathetic and want to join with you, but have a sense of your general safety? And if you do not feel you are safe, you can choose not to respond. You can also, and you should also consider asking for help, seeking help from others. When you talk to bystanders and they talk about what they saw and what they did, they will often say that when they fail to do anything, it's because they either don't know what to do or they don't know what the victim wants someone to do. So if you directly state out loud and directly ask someone to help, it makes your needs known, and it increases the chances that bystanders will overcome their hesitance and respond and do the things that you're asking. So being able to say, I want somebody to tell this guy to stop, increases the likelihood that the people around you will actually comply, and they'll step in and say, knock it off, she doesn't want that. I also encourage people to exploit technology. You know, if I was doing this talk 10 years ago, I wouldn't be able to mention almost any of these opportunities. But now many of us have a cell phone that we can either take pictures or take video. If you're on Facebook, they now have this thing, Facebook Live, where you can actually be streaming directly to Facebook in real time. Exploit technology. Capture video, capture pictures and images of the perpetrator. And if you feel like you can do so, make sure they know that you're doing it. Because nobody wants to be the latest viral video that's gone across the entire country of you being a jerk. So once they know you have a picture, this not only is often going to reduce their behavior because they don't want to be caught on camera doing this. But if you later choose to do something like file a police report, you'll be able to give people the image, the picture, the video of what happened. And that can help boost your case and the chances of them being prosecuted. And there's also apps you can use to share your story. Things like ihollaback.org or stopstreetharassment.com have places where you can write about what happened. And some you can do this on an app on your phone in real time, or you can get on the computer and talk about it later. But this not only allows things like the mapping of harassment, but it allows you to have voice when perhaps in that moment you felt like you were silenced. And there's another interesting thing out there. A woman recently came up with cards against harassment. And you can go to the website and you can download them and cut them out. And when people engage in harassment, you can give them a card if you so choose. And the cards have a variety of different sayings on them, but they say things directly like, this kind of behavior is inappropriate. This is not a compliment. This is harassment. And again, that's a pretty direct thing to do. Not everyone feels comfortable, but it can be one of the things. You hand them a card and you walk away, and it gives them an opportunity to read the card and have something to think about later. Some other things for responding to harassment that when you're targeted with harassment. Your best response is a clear, non-violent confrontation. And if you respond in a clear, non-violent manner, you will often throw the perpetrator off guard. They won't know what to make of it. They won't know what to do with it. They're surprised, and that might shut them down. Very often they'll back down, maybe even apologize. But what's critical in here is you want to stay calm. Don't engage in insults, sarcasm, cursing and yelling at the person. And you want to do things that make you physically powerful. So standing tall, making eye contact, using a matter-of-fact, firm voice. Don't smile. Don't do things that might undermine what you're saying verbally. And that includes, don't add the verbal fluff and padding that we tend to do. They're like, well, you know, I really would like it if you would please not do this. You know, stop. Don't talk to me that way. Being firm, making eye contact, using up space, making your body as big as you can. Some people talk about, you know, do this superwoman pose for whatever it's worth, but taking up space and showing confidence, even if you're faking it, is important. And what's critically important is don't start engaging with the person. Say what you're going to say and keep it moving. Because one of the things that people who don't have your best interests at heart, one of the things they will try to do is keep you talking. They want to keep you talking either so they can keep arguing with you, or they can start to belittle you or dismiss you or make fun of you. You don't want to get in a verbal war with these individuals. Again, remember, you're likely to move into flooding and they are likely not to move into flooding. So it's going to be a lose-lose proposition over time. You also don't want to give them more reinforcement and attention for their nasty behavior. So say what you're going to say and keep it moving. Don't get caught in a verbal tug of war. And so 5 confrontation tools. And this is taken from Martha Langeland, I can't say her last name, Langeland's Back Off, How to Confront and Stop Street Harassment and Harassers. And what's cool about this is Ms. Magazine has created a PDF that you can go to. It's at the bottom of the screen. And you can cut that out and keep it in your wallet so that you have on hand quick ideas of what you might do in the moment. So one, you want to name the behavior. Describe exactly what the harasser is doing and state what the behavior is. You're exposing yourself, or you're calling me nasty names. This is unacceptable. This basically is about respecting other human beings. I want you to stop, put your penis back in your pants, stop talking to me in this manner. But you name what they are doing, you state why it's a problem, and you state what you want them to do. You can also just have a very stock answer that you've rehearsed many, many times that you can say at the drop of a hat. You know, stop harassing me, stop harassing women. I don't like it. No one likes it. Show some respect. If you practice that enough, it will be something you can say easily, even if you're upset. You can also create a stop sign with your hands and literally stop right there. Stop talking to me. Don't say anything else. Don't come near me. It provides a barrier. It also makes your demands very clear, and it makes it clear to any bystanders what you want and don't want to have happening. And you can make an ABC statement. When you do A, the effect is B, and I want C. So when you are staring at my breasts, it makes me uncomfortable. I want you to stop looking at my chest. Or I want you to look at my face when I'm talking to you. And you can also ask a question. And if they're doing something really obnoxious, the questions can actually be quite fun. But something like, well, you know, that's so interesting. Can you explain to me why you think you can ask me to come back to your apartment to have sex with you when I've never seen you before in my life? So some of the success stories, and for the sake of time, I'm going to just do one of the stories. But if you go to the website, you can see lots of different stories. People have not only posted bad things that have happened, but they've posted their success stories in responding, but also success stories as bystanders. So I'll read the second one here. JT in Turin, Italy, announced to the whole bus what her harasser had just asked her for a pair of her panties. And he got off the bus at the next stop due to his embarrassment. So here, by asking a question and asking something that indicated how grossly inappropriate and obnoxious he was being, and making that public, she was able to not take on the shame, but shame him and get him to leave the bus. And the more people don't know what's going to happen when they do these behaviors, the more likely they are to stop engaging the behaviors. And I'll read one of these examples. Anonymous in Brooklyn, New York, confronted her harasser, asking for his name and asking why he felt it was acceptable to degrade women. So he quickly covered up his work badge and he left, kind of yelling an apology. So again, they don't expect a direct, assertive response. If you give them those responses, you can often stop them in their tracks and shut them down. So a big part of what we wanted to talk about today was also what can you do as a bystander? And wondering for time, why don't we'll watch one of the videos and then come back to the presentation, just for time's sake.
We are So the question is, what would you do? Americans get ugly. It's 6:30 on a Friday morning in downtown Linden, New Jersey, and these two men have stopped into a deli for coffee, and a bite to eat.
Get back in your pickup with the rest of your family and go, please.
But on this day, the only thing they're being served is prejudice.
We're building walls to keep you guys out of the country. You don't speak English, you don't get service. We don't serve your kind here.
If his bias seems familiar, it's because this is the same man we met last season, an actor hired by us behind the counter of this bakery in Texas.
We don't serve Muslims here.
I don't know what you think I am. I'm just trying to get an apple.
Well, you're a terrorist, is what you are.
Well, the bigot is back.
Taco. What don't you understand? You gotta go.
And this time, the targets of his prejudice are Latino day laborers. People like Mario Valdez. He wakes up at 5 a.m. 7 days a week and walks 2 miles to this spot on the side of a road. Here, he and 30 to 40 other Latino men stand around waiting and hoping to get picked up for a day of work.
How do people treat Mexican workers? ¿Cómo los tratan?
In some places good, and in others bad. When you go into a diner, sometimes they don't serve us a sandwich.
They won't serve you? They will not serve you? No te sirven? No?
English. You guys speak English, man.
English.
The Latino workers ask and then practically beg for help, but they quickly learn they're on their own.
Quick check. Quick check. He's not going to give you. He's not going to give you. I can't make him give you coffee.
Will any of these customers stand up for the Latino laborers?
We don't want the illegal alien money.
Plenty of people do take a stance. It's just not the one we expected.
You don't speak English.
Watch this guy.
Cops on you. If you want me to make you leave, I'll make you leave. So leave. That's what I gotta say, leave.
You hear that? These guys are criminals. You're illegal.
You scare the customers, bro. I think they're taking our job because we ain't got no job. So you
over legal and illegal immigrants, and whether they have a right to be here.
Out. Vámonos.
But when it comes to something as simple as being served a cup of coffee, why should any of them? Did he just say what I think he said?
Hello, sir. My name is John Quinones. I'm a reporter with ABC News. You told him I'm with you. We're cleaning house.
I agree with the illegals coming over illegally.
He, like lots of other Americans, believes there's only one right way to come into this country.
What is the problem with immigrants coming over to this country? I'm in America too.
The problem is the illegal coming, not following the rules. That's the problem.
When you introduced yourself,
Oh, sorry.
Business.
human being, but before that, you were just a part of a category, not even worthy of a look.
But this is a nation of immigrants.
What I said was do it the right way. Don't defend. Say don't send money back across the other country untaxed.
I'm glad he agrees to speak with me, but not everyone is so willing.
So they tried it again with using Latino women, seeing if gender mattered.
Think I did the right thing?
Sure enough, just as before, this guy agrees with the cashier. He doesn't want us to show you his face.
Right now. That's what I said.
That sounded racist in there.
A little bit, he was, but he did the right thing. I wanted to serve him.
Is it really tough in a really poor way like that and step on other people's toes, so to speak? No, but I'm speaking. Take it easy. You must be new here. We don't treat people like that.
Well, we're in America, right?
Yeah, that's right. Listen, if you can't deal with this country, now we accept other people. You don't belong working here. Certainly not live in New Jersey. Standing set, straighten them out.
Seth is the store manager who agreed to work with us. And remember, the racist cashier standing next to him is an actor. And so are the day laborers.
They don't speak a word of English. Well, you know what? Can you sit down in the back? What would you like, my friend?
People like this man speak up, compassionate, and tough.
Hurry up. Stop calling and start cooking. How's that sound? That type of activity just isn't tolerable. It just doesn't happen. Certainly not in front.
So take a minute or two and talk about what would stop you from intervening in street harassment. If you think about that example or think about another example, but what are the things that have gotten in the way of responding in the past? Fear, afraid of personally what might happen to you, of course. Things happening so fast you don't have a chance to figure out what to do and then it's over. Yeah, so the common reasons people are giving, and perhaps the ones that, when I think of my own experiences that have stopped me in the past from acting, as when I've seen other kinds of events happen to others, come down to some of the same basic themes. We're often ourselves as bystanders also afraid of the situation escalating, afraid that the negative interactions will be turned against us, afraid that somebody might decide to physically do us harm if we say something. And also this idea that, again, these are very, very short-lived events. I mean, the example I showed you is one where it went on for a few minutes, but often when we're talking about these kinds of events, it's very, very fast and it's over. And again, if we're trying to process what to do, we don't have a chance to do so before kind of things have moved on. And yes, this idea of perhaps I'm acting as a savior, whether it's a white savior or a privileged savior. I am doing something for someone else, and they might not necessarily want it. And when we can, checking in with the person to see what they would like us to do is a great idea, and we'll talk about that. But getting ourselves to the point where we're willing to do something, because we're all collectively harmed. It's not merely an incident that is harming that individual. It's harming us as bystanders. It's harming our communities. So saying something, even if you haven't had a chance to check in with the individual, speaking your truth. You know, I don't like seeing this behavior. That was nasty and ugly. I don't want that in my community. You can still speak from your own truth in most situations. And so why is it so important for bystanders to step up? The reality is the positive effects of an intervention are actually increased when it's happening from somebody outside of the situation. Meaning, if somebody is saying something inappropriate to me and I respond, it's not as powerful as somebody else coming in and saying something to the perpetrator. It's counterintuitive, but the perpetrator gives greater authority to an outside person saying something than to the person that they've already decided is not worthy of their respect. So the next thing out of my mouth as the target is not nearly as powerful because they've already demeaned me as a person. And when we're talking, whoops. sorry, touched a button. Okay, and when we talk about allies, we're in particularly talking about the fact that we have a domain of privilege. We're not part of the marginalized group, but we stand in solidarity despite having privilege along that same dimension. And we actively decide to use our privilege to forward social change. And so when allies engage in these behaviors, it's really quite powerful because others perceive allies as not having skin in the game. There's no reason why you should want to speak out on these issues. So I will perceive you as being less biased, more knowledgeable. I'm more likely to be convinced by what you have to say as an outside ally saying it. And you're going to be more effective in getting me to think about and change my behaviors. So bystanders and allies are really critical if we want to create these kinds of changes. But there's a lot of barriers to allies doing something. There are 5 stages that are 5 parts that have to all come into place before a bystander can do anything or will do anything. And these are just the 5 stages to get to doing something, and there's barriers at each of these stages. So the first stage, they have to notice that something's even happening. When you are out in public, there are all sorts of things that can interfere with any one person noticing that something's even happening. You know, it might be loud, so they didn't actually hear what was said. They may not be looking in your general direction and not be able to see your facial reaction or the fear or the distress on your face. They may have headphones in their ears, or they may kind of, because of their own privilege, they don't even realize that what just happened was something that was upsetting. One thing that can be useful is kind of going on your gut reaction. If you're in a situation and you start to have that sense in the center of your stomach of something being wrong, you can usually assume you're right, even if you don't quite know what happened or why you feel that way. And then you start paying more attention to figure it out. But people have to first even notice that there's something happening. And then when they notice it, they have to then say, oh, not only is something happening, but this is problematic and there needs to be something done about it. Now, this can be especially difficult when we're talking about subtle behaviors, and we also have a hard time seeing this as something that needs intervention when it appears that the 2 people have a relationship, particularly if it appears that they have an intimate relationship. And when we're trying to figure out if this is something that somebody should be intervening, we tend to look around and see what other people are doing. And if other people don't seem to be doing anything, then we're more likely to interpret it as that we shouldn't do anything either. So there's sadly this kind of growing of inaction, that if one person isn't doing anything, then I'm going to use that information to say, oh, well, I'm probably getting it wrong. I probably shouldn't intervene, or this probably isn't a big deal. And then even if you see a problem, even if you think it's a problem that is worthy of intervention, someone has to take personal responsibility that it's their job to intervene. And this can actually be quite complicated, because the more people that are around, the less likely any one person is going to think that they should be the one to intervene. They're far more likely to think there's probably 4 other people that have a much better idea of what they should be doing here. I don't know enough. I shouldn't be the one to intervene. It's also complicated if there's an identified office or person that's supposed to handle this. So if you're in a store and there's already a security guard, then you're more likely to say, well, that's the official person that should handle the situation, so I'm not the right one to get involved, and then we back off. So there's lots of things that get in the way of people taking personal ownership. Now, there are times when we are more likely to take personal ownership and responsibility. If we have some kind of relationship with the person being targeted, or if we have a vested interest in that person or some shared identity, we're more likely to think that we should be the one to do something. But in street harassment, we often aren't going to have those kinds of relationships. And we also, this is sad to say, but we also will look at the target and make determinations on whether or not they are a worthy victim. some easy examples when we're talking about gender-based street harassment, we typically look at things like, well, what is she wearing? What is she doing? Is she inviting the behavior somehow? And as inappropriate as that is, because street harassment is never okay, there's never anything somebody can be doing that justifies street harassment, these are the automatic thoughts that most people will have. And if they determine that the person is not a worthy victim, then they will decide that even if it's a problem and somebody should do something, I'm not the right person to do it. And even if we believe we should do something because it's a problem and it needs an intervention, we still have to know what to do, which is kind of why we're having this conversation. The reality is, most of the time, people do not know what to do, even if they feel an urgency to take some responsibility and intervene. And so the time it takes for them to figure out and have some idea of what to do can often result in losing the opportunity. And then they have to act on what they believe they should do. And this again can be a part where things like flooding, they may feel they should intervene, know what they should do, but because they themselves are flooded, they're stuck, they can't respond, they can't get the words out of their mouth, and then the situation passes, the people have walked away, and they missed their opportunity. So I love these bystander success stories, but we don't have much time, so I'll just go to one or two of them. So on public trains, if I see a man staring down a woman and she seems scared, I've locked eyes with him and started a conversation with the woman so she didn't seem so alone. My intervening has more so been making my presence known as a third party. I guess you'll have to see the other ones from the video, I'm sorry. Because I want to make sure we get to these last points. So I Holler Back posts their 4 Ds of badass interventions, which I love the chance that I get to say that on a webinar. But in these interventions, the first thing to remember is that the goal of intervening is to de-escalate. Never escalate the problem. Do whatever you can to de-escalate and avoid escalations. And you want to be focusing on the well-being of the target rather than shifting the focus to giving attention to the harasser. And consider how you might do each of these 4 Ds and then practice them and practice combining them. So the first D is direct intervention. And this is, of course, the most fear-provoking. It is the one that can seem most intimidating to use, but here you are confronting the harasser, you're naming what's happening. Of course, because this is risky, this is definitely a time where you're assessing your risk and making a smart determination if this can be done safely. And you want to follow all of the same things that I talked about earlier as with if you yourself are the target. So you want to be firm, be clear and concise. You want to say things kind of using a powerful stance, eye contact, firm voice, saying things like, that's inappropriate, leave them alone. Short, clear, concise. And then you also want to think about, am I the best person? Now, that can also lead people to inaction. But there can be times perhaps if you also are perhaps they're targeting a very small woman and you also are a very small person, maybe you are not the right person to do that because the risk to you as somebody and your safety might be more than to somebody else. But at least being thoughtful about that. You also want to try to assess if the person is uncomfortable or afraid. And when you can, check in with them, trying not to take any control away from them, and see what they need. You know, can I call someone for you? Can I wait with you until your bus arrives? You know, I got a picture of the guys that were harassing you. Here's my phone number. If you want the picture or you need a witness for your police report, feel free to call me. So notice I'm giving my number. I'm not also somebody saying, hey, give me your number. I'm giving my number. I'm putting them in control with whether or not they want to file a police report or if they want to have the video or the picture in order to post. I'm not taking it upon myself to just post a video of somebody else's experience. Distract. Distracting is an indirect intervention that is directly attempting to de-escalate the situation. So here you start talking to the targeted person about something that is completely different. So you might ask them for directions, ask if they watch a particular show. Me, I'm a Walking Dead fan, so hey, have you watched Walking Dead? In that, you're trying to make eye contact with them to show that you are empathizing with them, that you are showing solidarity, that they are not alone, which I saw one of the people in the earlier comments already makes that commitment to let people know that they are in solidarity, which I thought was beautiful. You can also do things like trying to get the person out of the line of sight of the harasser, or doing things that create a distraction that gets the target out of the general attention or line of sight of the perpetrator. Did we just lose the share screen? There we go. Okay. And delegate. When you're delegating, you're going directly to a third party and asking them for help, telling them what's happening. So this can be somebody who is a formal authority person, the person driving the bus, a teacher, a police officer, but this can also be other bystanders. So telling them what you're seeing, telling them that it's inappropriate, and asking them to do something specific, like, hey, did you see that? I'm gonna go stand between them. Come with me and get a video of it. And delay. One of the things that we know is a significant contributor to the trauma of harassment is the feeling that you're alone, that you're powerless, that you're vulnerable, and also that other people witnessed and no one did anything, no one cared about what happened to you. So delay is again about directly letting the individual know that you're in solidarity with them, but for whatever reason in the moment, maybe it didn't feel safe, maybe you were flooded, you didn't know what to do, but in the moment you were unable to respond, but you're still letting the person know that you saw it, it was real, you saw it, you thought it was bad, and that you are concerned about them as a person and their well-being. So you might let the person know you saw it, you thought it was wrong, asking if they're okay, if there's anything that they need that you might be able to do. You can volunteer to sit with them or to walk them somewhere. And again, offering that if they want somebody as a witness, you're willing to file a report, or if you know of local resources, if you're someone who has checked in with the local police department or campus police to know what are the appropriate responses, what are resources for victims, you can share that kind of information. But it makes sure that the person doesn't think they're on their own. And so when you're trying to use the 4 Ds of badass intervention, one, pick a D that works for you. And if you're struggling, think about that for a while. What is the struggle? What is the thing that's making it hard for you to do a particular D? And then think about, what was it that constrained you? What can you do to overcome that in the future? You can also think about, well, all right, I'm very comfortable with the delayed strategies. How can I move into maybe trying to distract? So trying to gradually grow the kinds of Ds that you are comfortable using. And one way is to also talk to other people that you trust, or people that seem to be really good at this kind of stuff, and getting ideas from them about what they do and what they do in the moment to make it possible to do it. So how do they get the courage up to do these things? And you also need to practice, and I can't emphasize this enough. Any intervention, whether it's an intervention because you are targeted or because you're a bystander, you have to practice a response, because in the moment you're likely to be somewhat flooded at least, and it will impair your ability to come up with these kinds of phrases. So repeat it out loud several times, role play it with your friends, have someone there who's able to give you feedback on the ways that you might be diminishing your impact or ways you can enhance your impact. And then as you find yourself more comfortable with using more of the Ds, combine them. you know, do something like a direct confrontation combined with distraction. So you tell the guy, stop it, knock it off, that's inappropriate, and you immediately switch to, how are you today? Did you get to see that Walking Dead episode? Okay, so I have to show you this one. I think this is amazing. This is Snack Man. This is an intervention that was caught on camera and has gone viral. So I want you to look at this and think about which Ds are being used, but I also think it's critical to notice what happens as a result of his intervention. What is it that other people do once the first person acts? So this was a stranger that started following her.
We got you on camera. Don't follow. We got you.
Please get off. Please.
So what I love about that video, you know, several different pieces, but his intervention was very, very simple. He simply he may not have fully understood at the moment that this was somebody who had been following her. We don't know necessarily what he was thinking, but he took the initiative to get in between the two of them at that critical juncture, which was important. But what I also love about this intervention is that it created momentum for all of the other people that were seeing this event and probably had no idea what to do or how to respond. So him simply getting between the two of them and casually eating his potato chips gave other people, one, it was the cue that yes, there is a problem that requires intervention. Remember, if you don't see other people respond, you have a harder time responding. So it gave people that cue that they needed to do something, or that something needed to be done. It also gave them some time. Remember, often these things happen quickly and you don't get a chance to think it through. But it offered a little bit of time so other people could think, how might I help this situation? And so you see the contagion factor, where his intervention led to another person getting up and physically standing between them, and then also taking the extra step of saying, you need to get off of this train. You're not going to be able to follow her to her destination and then get off and keep harassing her. You need to get off. And blocking his ability to do anything really but get off. And you also heard someone else say, hey, dude, we got you on camera. So now he knows that he could potentially be someone that the police start looking for because his actions and his image are captured. And what's interesting is that person had already been videotaping it, but they didn't tell the guy that they were videotaping it until after these other two people had intervened. So perhaps initially he thought, oh, this was funny, but whatever transpired, it gave him the opportunity and the courage to say, we've got you on camera. Basically, you're going to have more accountability. You better go ahead and get out of here. So it's important to think about how one person standing up in that moment can also lead to this chain effect where others are willing to step in and kind of have the initial person's back, and it gives them an opportunity to think about what to do. But I will also point out there's something that he did that was critically wrong, and I imagine several of you picked up on this. he should never have turned his back to the perpetrator. What I always tell people is you always keep your eye on the perpetrator. You don't turn your back to them, whether they are 3 times smaller than you or not. You keep your eye on the perpetrator because they have the most to lose. They're the ones that's most likely to do something crazy. And so what that means is you might come across, you might block the two, but you're still facing the perpetrator. You might come across so that you can talk to that targeted person while still keeping your eye on the perpetrator, but you do not turn your back on a perpetrator. And I realize now it's 4:36. There may be some of you that have to go since we did plan on ending at 4:30. I will go ahead with my last slide, but again, the video will be made available for everyone. And so I have the extra couple of minutes, but I understand if people do need to get off right now. So all of those bystander strategies that I talked about really imply that you were not only a bystander, but you were also a stranger to the situation. And that is not always going to be the case. You might actually be there when someone you know well, somebody you're friends with, someone you admire, is engaging in that behavior. And for a lot of people, talking with a friend can actually be harder than talking with a stranger. So here are some of the things that you might also do when you're talking to a friend. And part of it is when you're talking with a friend, you have an opportunity for prolonged engagement and conversation and for multiple interactions about this event over time. So you don't have to pack the entire punch. You just are trying to introduce the conversation. So one, you can stall. You can stall them. Like, what is it you just said? What did you say? It sounded like you just yelled at them to go back to Mexico. You can ask questions. Wow, what do you think you would do if someone said that to your little sister? Do you think that about all Muslims or just 1 or 2 people? Because that's like really, really different. Or, I never thought of you as someone that would say something like that. Have you always felt this way and I just missed it somehow? You can also express disagreement. Hey, they have the right to wear that, or they have the right to pray just like everyone else. This is a free country. And I encourage people to focus on the behavior, not the person. Because when you start focusing on the person, one, their defenses are going to go even higher because they will interpret that as you're saying they are a bad person versus they did something inappropriate. And they will shut down. They will not be open to your influence. So if you can focus on the behavior, not the person, although they are still likely to have a negative response, at least initially, you will have a better chance of having leeway into the conversation. And this video I thought was really, really a good discussion of why you need to do that.
Race, the final frontier. No matter what channel you watch, no matter what feed you aggregate, it seems like everybody everywhere is talking about race right now. And when everybody everywhere is talking about race, that means sooner or later you're going to have to tell somebody that they said something that sounded racist. So you need to be ready and have a plan in place for how to approach the inevitable that sounded racist conversation. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. The most important thing that you've got to do is remember the difference between the what they did conversation and the what they are conversation. Those are 2 totally different conversations, and you need to make sure that you pick the right one. The what they did conversation focuses strictly on the person's words and actions and explaining why what they did and what they said was unacceptable. This is also known as the that thing you said was racist conversation, and that's the conversation that you want to have. The what they are conversation, on the other hand, takes things one step further and uses what they did and what they said to draw conclusions about what kind of person they are. This is also known as the I think you are
are a racist conversation. This is the conversation you don't want to have, because that conversation takes us away from the facts of what they did and the speculation about their motives and intentions, and those are things you can only guess at, you can't ever prove, and that makes it way too easy for them to derail your whole argument. And that is the part that's crucial to understand. When you say, I think he's a racist, that's not a bad move because you might be wrong. That's a bad move because you might be right. Because if that dude really is racist, you want to make sure you hold him accountable and don't let him off easy. And even though intuitively it feels like the hardest way to hit him is just run up on him and say, I think your ass is racist, when you handle it that way, you're actually letting him off easy because you're setting up a conversation that's way too simple for him to derail and duck out of. Just think about how this plays out every time a politician or a celebrity gets caught out there. It always starts out as a what they did conversation. But as soon as the celebrity and their defenders get on camera, they start doing judo flips and switching it into a what they are conversation. I have known this person for years, and I know for a fact that they are not a racist, and how dare you claim to know what's inside their soul just because they made one little joke about watermelon tap dancing and going back to Africa. And then you try and explain that we don't need to see inside their soul to know that they shouldn't have said all that about the watermelon. And you try to focus on the facts of the situation, but by then it's too late because the what they are conversation is a rhetorical Bermuda Triangle where everything drowns in a sea of empty posturing until somebody just blames it all on hip-hop and we forget the whole thing ever happened. Don't let this happen to you. When somebody picks my pocket, I'm not going to be chasing him down so I can figure out whether he feels like he's a thief deep down in his heart. I'm going to be chasing him down so I can get my wallet back. I don't care what he is, but I need to hold him accountable for what he did. And that's how we need to approach these conversations about race. Treat them like they took your wallet and focus on the part that matters, holding each person accountable for the impact of their words and actions. I don't care what you are. I care about what they did.
Okay, so yes, he says that much better and much faster than I could say it. But the bottom line is, when we're talking about the people that we have longer term relationships, whether it's an employer, an employee, coworker, family members, friends, we have to be thoughtful about the way we're doing those interactions because we have a long-term investment in how those interactions go. And whether you know them or not, it's very easy for people to shut down when the conversation is, you are a whatever-ist. So focusing in on the behavior in question versus the person as a whole is often going to lead to more productive conversation. So here, briefly moving from intervention to prevention, there are how-to guides on how to be more activists around these issues, including things like having a safety audit or starting a map of harassment events, hosting workshops, having film screenings. And sadly, given our time, I would be interested in focusing on this last piece. What is one skill or item that you're willing to focus on this week and try to improve upon so that you can be the best interventionist, best bystander interventionist that you can be? So if you would put some of that into the chat comments for us, that would be great. I'm very curious to know what you're willing to do this week. And again, this list of resources will be made available for you. You will have access to this video so that you can review any of the parts or see any of the links that you may have wanted to revisit. And I want to thank you for your participation today. You know, when we are all willing to step up and to act, we have the power not only to change that moment in time, but our collective action can also have an incredibly powerful impact on changing the cultural norms that allow these kind of behaviors to persist. So So I do hope that some of the strategies that we've discussed today have inspired you to take charge of street harassment, helped you to channel your inner badass and intervene on your own behalf and on the behalf of the people around you. And I would also love to know what kind of strategies you've been able to use, perhaps things that we didn't talk about today, that you've been able to use successfully. So feel free to share that with the group. You can do that within the chat. And if you need to go before you can do so, feel free to email me. And thank you for attending this webinar.
All right. Thank you so much, NiCole, for everything that you've done to bring this together and get us up to speed. I'm seeing some other thank yous coming through. And I'm glad, too, that you provided your contact information so that people can follow up. At this point, if it makes sense, I'm going to end the webinar, and folks can follow up by email. And a recording of this webinar will be made available for the website. So we will disseminate that on the listserv. And if you guys have any questions, as always, feel free to contact me. This is Taylor Scott. And my information is also on the website under the Executive Committee information on the leadership page of SCRAW's website. So thank you guys, and have a happy holidays otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.